Welcome to this video on interest rate risk, which is intended for those involved in the asset liability management function, including personnel and members of a bank's asset liability committee. In this video, we'll discuss deposit assumptions, including both runoff assumptions and price sensitivity assumptions. We'll also talk about how sensitivity analyses are conducted.
Assumptions used in interest rate risk modeling are important for capturing a bank's exposure to interest rate risk. Non-maturity deposits, such as demand deposits, savings, and money market accounts, represent an important part of the liability structure for community banks. These deposits are challenging to model since the accounts do not have contractual cash flows or maturity dates. Subjective assumptions are usually developed to assess how deposit volumes and rates will respond to projected market rate changes within the measurement systems.
As the chart illustrates, a certain amount of runoff occurs due to the continuous flow of funds into and out of non-maturity deposits. This runoff is depicted by the black dotted line. In economic value of equity, or EVE models, which are point-in-time measurements, the primary challenge is estimating this deposit runoff. Alternatively, in an income simulation model, no growth or static scenarios typically assume that the runoff is replaced to maintain deposit balances. This is depicted in the blue section of the chart. Dynamic simulations may include growth beyond what is needed to replace runoff and is represented by the red portion of the chart.
Deposit runoff is typically captured within the model through decay rates and weighted average life. Decay rates are the annual rate of deposit runoff, while weighted average life is how long a non-maturity deposit is expected to remain in the bank. Decay rates are calculated by dividing the runoff amount for a given measurement period by the total deposits for that product at the beginning of the measurement period. The weighted average life is calculated by using the annual rate of decay to determine how long deposits will remain within the bank. There's an inverse relationship between the decay rate and the weighted average life, meaning the higher the decay rate, the lower the weighted average life of the deposit, and vice versa. However, keep in mind that while decay rates can be used to determine weighted average life, they are not the same thing and cannot be used interchangeably within the model.
To measure runoff, community banks typically conduct deposit studies. A study of non-maturity deposits can track account openings and closings or account balances at the product or account level. Simply tracking account openings and closings is insufficient because changes in dollar volume will not be taken into consideration. However, this can be useful in determining the average life of deposits. Tracking balances at the product or account level can assist management in determining changes in the non-rate sensitive balances of established relationships, as opposed to rate-sensitive balances. This method can help determine runoff rate.
The most comprehensive analysis will track deposits by both openings and closings and product or account levels. But remember that tracking forms the quantitative basis for support, with history as the guide. Qualitative factors may need to be adjusted because they could impact the deposit account life estimate.
In addition to assumptions for volume changes, assumptions regarding deposit price sensitivity, also known as beta assumptions, are typically developed. Deposit price sensitivity assumptions forecast to what degree deposit rates may change relative to market interest rates. The formula for a simple beta calculation is a change in the product rate divided by the change in the market rate.
For example, if a deposit rate is expected to change 40 basis points when market rates change by 100 basis points, the result is a 40% deposit beta or price sensitivity to the market rate. Price sensitivity or beta assumptions may differ depending on the current level of market interest rates, as well as the direction and magnitude of the rate changes modeled.
Effective management teams understand the beta assumptions used within the models to ensure that the assumptions are reasonable in both rising and falling rate scenarios. Depending on the current level of market rates and competitive factors, some banks may experience different betas in rising versus falling rate environments. Generally, management can expect different betas for scenarios of varying magnitude.
Let's take a look at a period when a full rising rate cycle occurred. During the initial phase of the rate increase, which occurred over the course of 1 year, the federal funds rate rose by roughly 200 basis points. During this initial cycle phase, over 60% of the banks were able to maintain a beta of under 20% for money market deposit accounts and savings accounts, and relatively few banks had a beta over 40%. However, as we look at the full spectrum of the rate cycle, which occurred over the course of 3 years, 60% of banks experienced betas above 20%, due in part to their efforts to maintain deposit balances.
The development of beta assumptions often begins with historic analysis to determine how product rates may have responded to changing market interest rates. Banks can assess how historical data can be adjusted for qualitative factors and used within the measurement systems. For example, a financial crisis will typically trigger a flight to quality. Couple this with a low rate environment, and the result is a minimal yield differential between bank and non-bank investments. Factors such as these typically contribute to unusually high levels of non-maturity deposits, or surge deposits.
In addition, non-maturity deposit balances will increase as customers park funds in these deposits until alternative investment yields become more attractive. In the modeling process, management may consider the possibility that changing economic conditions could produce opportunities for its customers to deploy cash in non-deposit alternatives. This would cause more deposit runoff than experienced historically. In rising rate environments, customers could become more sensitive to the rates paid on their deposits.
For time deposits, keep in mind that early withdrawal penalties on low-rate time deposits may not be a deterrent to early redemption. Finally, the introduction of new product technologies, trends in local demographics, competition, and other qualitative factors may lead to unexpected runoff that could also affect pricing decisions.
With assumptions, a bank also needs to determine which have the most influence on the model results. This can be done by conducting sensitivity testing or sensitivity analysis. This is performed by taking the original model report, that is, the one presented to the board, changing a single key assumption, rerunning the model, and reviewing the differences between the two results.
By holding all other model variables and assumptions constant, management can determine both the extent to which an assumption influences model results and at what point that exposure becomes potentially excessive or breaches policy limits. Generally, the most effective approach is to perform this review separately for each key assumption.
Since deposit assumptions are usually some of the most influential assumptions, let's begin with an example of sensitivity analysis performed on beta assumptions. This demonstrates how a beta of 35% depicts more customer price sensitivity than a beta of 20%.
In this simplistic analysis, when the rate shock is up 300 basis points, net interest income is projected to fall 15%, when the beta is assumed to be 20%. If the beta were instead 35%, net interest income could be expected to fall significantly more, in this case by 25%. Management can periodically perform this type of sensitivity analysis on each of the key assumptions to identify where interest rate risk is significantly elevated. They can also determine which assumptions cause the most influence on the model results.
Let's look at another sensitivity test, this one for decay rates. The chart depicts the differences in the present value of cash flows from deposits given different decay rates. A decay rate of 20% indicates that 20% of deposits will run off annually, while a decay rate of 50% reflects that 50% of the deposits will leave each year. In the rising 300 basis point scenario, the lower 20% decay rate produces about $10,000 more in economic value than if the decay rate was much higher at 50%. In the down 100 basis point scenario, additional economic value is also evident using the lower decay rate. A lower decay rate reflects that deposits are assumed to be held at the bank for a longer period of time, which means the value of those deposits are perceived to be higher than that of deposits with higher decay rates. After performing the EVE analysis and reviewing model results, management can use sensitivity analysis to consider whether the assumptions are reasonable, given what is known about customer behavior, and also to determine how influential a given assumption is on the model results.
Some questions to consider when assessing your bank's deposit assumptions include: what deposit assumptions are used within the measurement system? Are deposit assumptions internally generated, or are they provided by a vendor? If vendor supplied, are deposit assumptions consistent with bank customer behavior? Are deposit assumptions reviewed and updated periodically? Which deposit assumptions have the most influence on model results?
To summarize this video, interest rate risk management relies heavily upon assumptions for customer rate sensitivity and deposit runoff. Historical analysis and qualitative adjustments create a foundation for building assumptions. Assumptions need to be reasonable for the risk profile of the bank and the current interest rate cycle. Management may wish to identify and test assumptions that have the most influence on model results.
As we conclude, we'd like to remind you that the FDIC has additional videos and resources that can be found on the Banker Resource Center at www.fdic.gov. If you need additional information or have questions or comments, please contact your bank's case manager or email the FDIC at supervision@fdic.gov. Thank you for viewing this video. We hope you found it both useful and informative.